Hello! Welcome to a video where I'm going to talk about the JavaScript library called Jquery. Jquery is one of the most popular libraries that's in use on the web, and it's really popular because the key thing that it does is it just makes working with web pages easier. So you're already familiar with this idea that we can manipulate a web page with JavaScript through this thing called the document object model. And with various built-in methods that we get from the browser. Jquery is about doing the same kinds of things, but it's about making it easier for you to do. So what I want to do in particular with this video is just get a sense of the basic philosophy of Jquery. You use it in a very particular way, and just to go through the same kinds of examples of the sort of fundamentals of manipulating a web page, except to do it with Jquery this time. But before we get started, we should go and look at the Jquery website, just so that we can kind of get a little introduction to it and sort of scope out the most important pieces of what they provide to us in terms of information. So let's go and do that first. So I'll head over to my browser here, and I'm going to go to jquery.com. One of the things that I always notice about jquery.com is how corporate it looks. Certainly it's not one of those libraries that's trying to appeal to the youth or anything like that. It's very kind of old school web design, I would say. It doesn't scream out that you can do creative and exciting things with jQuery, but you can. jQuery is a very exciting library because it facilitates working with web pages, and because web pages are exciting. Anything that makes our job easier on that front can be used to do really interesting work. So I feel like the website itself is a little deceptive. I'm pleased to see that they do have a Black Lives Matter banner at the top. That is a good thing. So what is jQuery? Well, they've got their own little explanation here. A fast, small, and feature-rich JavaScript library. And then the things that they describe here are the kinds of things that are just the regular things that we want to kind of achieve on web pages. jQuery does provide extras on top of that, and we'll look at those. But for now, I'm just interested in the basics of how it works. As you can see, jQuery has changed the way that millions of people write JavaScript, and it's about to change how you write JavaScript as well. So we get the sense that jQuery is this kind of do-it-all tool, which is great. It's very, very popular. It is true that it has changed the way that millions of people write JavaScript. If you look at examples of people doing web programming online, so much of the time people just assume that you're using jQuery, just as a matter of course. So it's really, really fundamental to the way a lot of people work. So what does jQuery look like? Let's keep scrolling down. We'll ignore these related projects. That will be relevant a little later on in other videos. And you can see that here's the sort of the most basic kind of example here, which is they say that they're getting the button element, which has the class continue, and they're changing its HTML to say next step. And in here, I'm not going to go into how this is working because we'll do our own kind of walking through the different basic things that jQuery facilitates, but I just want to point out really, in many ways, this dollar sign. This dollar sign is the best way to recognize that jQuery is going on, and we'll look at what the dollar sign means and how we use it, but this is sort of the way that jQuery looks. They have, I would say, forgotten their semicolon at the end of this line, but that's okay. I will just lower their grade a tiny bit. We'll get on to like how this works, but that's what jQuery looks like. You've probably seen it before if you've been searching for how to code things online. And that's it. It is a fairly straightforward library in the sense that there's not a lot of complexity in how it works. The complexity, such as it is, exists in just how big it is in terms of what's possible. So before we leave this homepage, I just want us to spot a couple of the most important links that we have available here. So we've got a link here to download the library. That's clearly going to be important when we want to use it, so we should remember that and always be trying to spot it. There's also a nice, oh, you see that animation? That was pretty cool. You can see that you can also click this giant download button here. You can see there's stuff around version numbers as well. The latest version right now is version 3.5.1. Crucially, the API documentation is linked. We are seasoned programmers, so we know that the API documentation is kind of where it's at in terms of understanding how to use a library. So of course we take note that that is there. I don't really care about their blog personally. You could read it if you want to. There's other things here, like everything's going to be interesting, right? But I think the key really is download, because we want to be able to get the library, API documentation, because we want to be able to know how to use it. And then over here, it's worth noting that they have a Learning Center link, and that contains a bunch of tutorials and explanations of how jQuery works if you kind of want to support your learning further than what we'll cover in these videos that I'm going to make about jQuery. So there's more there. Those are kind of the big three, I think. This cool little animation actually reminded me that it is worth noticing these three big things that they clearly want us to notice. One of them is it's a small library, which is great. The smallness just essentially means that it won't take so long to download, right, for the users of your website. So that's worth knowing. CSS3 compliant. Well, CSS3 is the standard, so it is a good thing that we are compliant with it. And this is one of the secret big deals about jQuery, and one of the reasons that people use it fanatically. It hides a lot of the difficulties that you can run into where you have to write code in different ways depending on which browser the user is looking at your website in. This is sort of like, I think that the sort of the target of a lot of this is Internet Explorer, which is kind of deprecated as a browser at this point, but millions of people still use. It has different ways of doing things that can mean that you have to write different kinds of code to make your program cross-browser compatible. jQuery does that work under the hood, so at least for the kinds of tasks that jQuery does, you don't have to worry so much about what browser the user is looking at your website through. So that's an introduction to the sort of the homepage of jQuery and where we can direct our attention if we want to return to it. As I said, though, the objective, at least for this video, is that it'll all be kind of in-house. We're going to get an overview by just looking at things step by step. So the first thing that we need, therefore, is to dive into coding, of course, but we're going to need a web page in order to manipulate a web page. That kind of makes sense. And so I'm going to need to start a web project, and I'm going to do that over in my repository over here, car263 topics. I'm going to make a new folder called jQuery, because that's what we're talking about. And I'm going to open that folder in Attr over here. Where's Attr? There it is. So I've got my jQuery folder open, and because this is a web project, I'm going to make a new file called index.html. That's going to contain my website. And then in the notes for this lecture, or video, whatever you want to call this, do you feel like I'm lecturing you? We're just chatting. So I'm just going to paste in the HTML from there, which did not highlight properly. So let's close it and open it again. There we go. Classic restart the router kinds of reasoning. There's nothing special about this website. Let's run it in our live server over here. Actually, we don't really need jQuery open there anymore. Let me run it in Atom Live Server. It just looks like that, right? It's just some headings and some paragraphs and a link. Too thick, obviously. So nothing special. It's just some stuff that we can manipulate. In it, it's got things like, it's got headings with IDs. The headers all have the same class of header. What else can I point out here? There's a span in here, so we can target this text inside the span if we want to. There's a link, and that's about it. And it links to our script file, which doesn't exist right now, so I'm going to need to create that at the bottom of the body, for the same reasons that we do that when we're doing any kind of programming in relation to a web page that needs to access the web page. We want our script to load last. So actually, while I'm here, let me create a JS folder, and in that, let me create a script.js file that we can actually work with. I'm not going to put anything in here yet, except for 2 forward slashes apparently. But that is where we will be doing our programming, just like usual, right? So we're ready, we're excited, we want to use jQuery, but right now we don't have jQuery. jQuery is a library, and libraries are a thing that we have to go out into the internet and obtain. So how do we get the jQuery library? Well, we probably remember when we went to jquery.com about 5 minutes ago that there was this giant thing that said download jQuery. So I'm going to click on that. That makes a huge amount of sense to me, and hopefully also to you. But before I go ahead with my chosen strategy for downloading jQuery, I'm just going to point out that there are two basic ways that we can get hold of the library, and this is true for a lot of libraries. One way is perhaps the way that you're more familiar with at this point in your programming career, maybe not, which is that you go and find the actual file that represents the library. It presumably ends in .js, so we could imagine this one is jquery.js or something, and you download the file, you put the file inside your project, and you link to it with a script tag from inside index.html. And we can do that with jQuery, right? That's what this first section here is about. It says downloading jQuery, and we would just probably use this very first link. Download the compressed production jQuery 3.5.1, which is the newest version. If I click on this, we get this kind of terrifying text screen, but you're probably familiar enough with these kinds of things that you look up here in the browser bar and you see that this is a file, right? jQuery 3.5.1.min, which means it's minified. That's why it looks so frightening and impossible to read, .js. So this is the library. So one option is that I can then, I could go and save this file, save page as, save it to my desktop or wherever, and drag that over into my project as a file. That's not the option I'm going to use because I want us to look at a different option. So that would be one way to do it. The other way that you can, I'm going to pretend I didn't notice that my voice just did that. The other way that you can obtain libraries is via this thing called a CDN, which stands for Content Delivery Network. And what a CDN does is that it hosts libraries, various libraries, online, and you access them and use them on this other server that is hosting the library for you. That means that you don't have to have the file on your computer inside your project. You just use it as like a link to the library somewhere else. And there are benefits to this. The big benefit of using a CDN, the library hosted somewhere else, is that you can often take advantage of caching, which means that if your user has run into this library on this CDN before, it'll be cached on their computer and they won't have to download it again, which is nice. If it's a file in your project, they're kind of going to end up having to download the file with their browser. But using a CDN, this online version, does mean that you can't work on your project if you don't have access to the internet because it's hosted somewhere else. So that's a caution. That said, using CDN links is a really nice way to quickly get a library working. So I'm going to do that. So where would we do that? Well, we have to search down this page a distance because it's going to talk about other things first, like NPM and Yarn. Don't worry about them. Bower. These are all ways that you can install libraries from the command line of your computer. The jQuery migrate plugin, goodness gracious me, cross-browser testing, pre-release builds, and finally we get down to using jQuery with a CDN, which is what we want. jQuery is not the world's best at making information super accessible. I don't really understand why, but they're not. However, if we keep reading this, it says you can get the complete script tag, including sub-resource integrity attribute, which sounds very nice, by visiting code.jquery.com and clicking on the version of the file that you want to use. So the answer here is that the CDN version of jQuery, or one of them, is hosted here at code.jquery.com. So that's where I'm going to click on. And what we get now is a list of versions of the library, and we're going to just choose which one we want. So I want the latest version of jQuery, which is 3.5.1. Now, do I want an uncompressed version, a minified version, a slim version, or a slim minified version? You can make informed choices about this later on. For now, I'm going to get the minified version. That's going to be the fully featured version of jQuery, but compressed, so it's not too big. So I'm going to click on that. And the nice thing is it gives me the actual script tag that I need to use. So it's as easy as copying this. I can click their nice little copy button. Copy. And I can go and paste that now into my project. So let's head back over here. And where do I put my library? I put it at the bottom of the head. So I'm going to paste it in there. It made my thing scroll horizontally. So here's my script tag that I got from code.jquery.com, and that will link jQuery into my project. So now I have the library, right, by copying and pasting that link. Wonderful. So now I'm ready to work with jQuery. Again, you can download the file and include it that way. Completely up to you. I'm going to follow this path just because I find it a tiny bit easier. So we have jQuery in our project. That means that we could go over to our script and start writing jQuery stuff, right? So how do we do it? This is where we want to think about and understand the basic philosophy of how jQuery works, which is that jQuery most fundamentally is about making it easy to select portions of a web page, get access to specific elements on a web page, and then act on them in some way. So jQuery provides this simplified mode of selecting things on a web page, and then it provides a whole bunch of methods that you can use to act on the things that you have selected. So what does that look like? Let's look at this in two pieces. So we know that in index.html we've got an h1 tag or element that has an ID of main heading. So let's select the main heading. Now, how do I select the main heading in jQuery? I use the Jquery function. So fundamentally in jQuery, pretty much everything emerges from this idea of using the Jquery function. And the Jquery function's name is just a $sign. So the Jquery function, that's the Jquery function. It looks like that. Inside the Jquery function, the most common argument that we are going to give, the most common piece of information that we will tell it is the CSS selector of what we want to get access to on the page. So if I want to get access to the main heading, then in a string, I write #, because that's how we specify an ID, main-heading, which is the ID of the main heading element on the page. And jQuery will go away, find the element with the ID of main heading, and select it and give it back to us, right? So this tidy little unit here with the $sign up front, which is the function name, selects the main heading and returns it. So if it's returning it, then I should probably put it into a variable. So this is a lot like using document.getElement by ID, right? It's just pithier, it's smaller. That's the first advantage, because we just write $sign and then the thing that we want to get, the CSS selector that we want to access. Now, we're assigning it into a variable here. And a really good convention to follow, I think personally, is that if we're selecting things with jQuery, the thing that it gives us back is a special kind of jQuery version of the element on the page. So it's not just the standard HTML element, it's a jQuery version of it. Because of that, it's a good idea to name variables in your program that have jQuery elements in them with a $sign in front of the variable name. That way you know that this is the jQuery representation of the main heading, right? It just makes things a little bit clearer. So that's selection. We've selected the main heading element with this nice kind of brief notation, and then we can do something to it. And so jQuery provides a ton of methods on these objects that are returned. So main heading is a jQuery object, and it has lots of methods, and one of those methods is called CSS. So I'm going to use that to set the CSS of the main heading. And one way that we can write this is we write a string with the name of the property to set, which is color. I'm going to set the color of the heading. And then the second argument, a string with what you want to set it to. And I'm going to set it to 339966. That's the hex code for the color I'm going to use. So we select the main heading using the Jquery function. And then on the selected element, the main heading variable has it inside. We use the CSS method to set the color to this 339966. So what does that look like? Looks like the Jquery website. That's surprising. No, that is not correct. Let me close this for the moment. There we go. So here's the main heading. It used to be black, I'm sure you recall, and now it is this green color. So all that shows us is that this works, right? Which is hopefully not surprising. It would be disappointing if it didn't. But the thing that we want to appreciate here is how nice and tidy this is. How nice it is to be able to select an element on a page with such a compressed notation, $sign, and then the CSS selector, the Jquery function, and the CSS selector as an argument. And then the fact that jQuery gives us these nice ways to do things to the elements, such as the CSS method. We'll talk more about that in a moment, to set a color on the CSS. For example, so that we wouldn't be writing main heading.style.color is assigned this thing. So this brevity is currently the big advantage that we're getting here. Okay, now, nice revelation number one. We don't really need to do this in 2 steps. Currently we're doing it in 2 steps, but we could do this in a single step by saying select the main heading, main-heading with the jQuery function, select it, and then the thing that comes out of that, set its CSS and set its color to be, let's just use, let's use red this time so that we can see that this is now taking effect. We can do it all in one line, right? So select this, and the thing that gets selected by this, do this to it. And this is by far the more common way that you'll see jQuery code being written, that you often won't see this intermediate step of assigning a selection into a variable. So if we do that, then the heading is red, because we have selected the heading by its ID, and then we've set its CSS. That's big win, nice kind of like easily, I think, readable line of code for changing the CSS of a specific element on the page, and brief and easy to achieve. This gets even nicer when we decide that we want to select something by a different kind of selector, such as the class. So we know that the main heading and this subheading and this subheading here all have the class of header. If we were wanting to select those with the standard DOM API, we know that we could do get elements by class name, and then we could loop through all of the elements and individually set their CSS in some way, right? jQuery makes this significantly easier. In fact, if we wanted to make them all red, all we would need to do is change what we're selecting. So I want to select the header class, so I say .header. We know that that is the CSS expression for selecting things with a class of header. That's what jQuery expects, is CSS selectors in here. So we select it, and then we say everything that matches this, set its color to red using the CSS method. There's no need to loop through them or anything like that. We don't have to put them into a kind of an array and then loop through that array and set each one. We just act on them in exactly the same way. If we go back, they've all turned red. That, my friends, is very powerful. This is one of the big powers of jQuery right away, right? It really simplifies how we can write our code. This is so much easier than what we would have to do in the DOM API. So multiple selection, super duper easy, and works in the same way you can apply these methods to multiple selections as well as to just single elements. Okay, we've almost covered kind of the entirety of what jQuery is basically the big thing that it's great at. I just want to return to this idea up here. So we used a variable. I used that to break down this idea of selection and action into 2 phases. But let's think about this a little more closely. So what if I ignored that and I said, I'm going to select all of the headers, and I'm going to set their color to red, and then I'm going to select all of the headers again, and I'm going to set their background color to black. And I'm also going to select the headers, and I'm going to set their font size to what? 3 rem. So based on what we've seen so far, this would be, it seems reasonable, and it is actually fine, I should say. This is fine. This is a little bit less efficient than we could be writing it, however, because each time we include this jQuery selection function, here, here, and here, jQuery has to go to the document, search through it, find all of the things that match the class of header, and then give them back. And it's doing this 3 times, right? It's going to find all of the headers once here, set them to red, then it's going to find them all again and set them to black, and it's going to find them all again and set their size to 3 rem. That's slightly inefficient. Generally speaking, if you're going to act on the same set of elements more than once, this is when it is a good idea to put them into a variable. So I would say we should make a headers variable, assign all of the headers into it, so we just go and find them one time, and then we would just use the variable here, the headers variable that we created, right? So it's a simple little change, but this is technically, I would suggest, better programming practice. We select them once, and then we act on that selection 3 times. There's this tiny, tiny efficiency gain. You probably wouldn't notice if you never did this, but it's nice to know. And maybe it makes you feel a bit clever. Oh, let's go and look at it and make sure that it worked. Yeah, it looks gross, but there we go. It worked. Okay. So the question becomes, now that you've understood this kind of fundamental idea of you select something, such as the header class, and then you act on it with a method of some kind, such as using jQuery to set its color to yellow, let's say. And that goes away, finds all of the things that match, and applies this, this particular method to all of them. So all of their CSS is changed, and that's a beautiful thing. To some extent, that's jQuery. That's what it is. So what do you need to know in order to kind of be good at jQuery? Really, it's what's available. Like, what other stuff is there? So we know that there's apparently a method called CSS. What's available? And the answer to that, of course, is that you need to go to the jQuery website, and you need to look at the API documentation, right? That's how you know. You can also look at examples of people's work online. You can also do tutorials. Fundamentally, all of the actual information about what's available is here. I'm not gonna go through this, but I'm just gonna scroll through. So by default, you can see just an alphabetical list of every single method that you can use. Again, a lot of these, or probably most of these, are based on selecting something and then acting on it with one of these. Although there's some variation within this as well. So there's a lot. All I want you to know right now is there's a lot of methods available, and they're broken down into some categories over here on the left-hand side. If you're looking for something specific, like how do I manipulate CSS, I could click through the CSS link, and I could find a sort of a reduced list of the kinds of things that are connected to CSS. Still quite a few. And in particular, here's that CSS method that we were using just before, right? So I could get the specific documentation for the CSS method, and I might return to that in a moment. But fundamentally, how do you do things with jQuery? You need to leverage the API. In this particular series of videos that I'm doing about jQuery, I'm just going to show you different things that we can do. So we've been looking at the CSS method, right? So we've been using it. It's fairly clear that what we can do is we can use it to change the CSS of an element. If we want to know the details, then we would engage with the CSS documentation, which we just went to. If we look at that, we can see that there's actually 2 things that the CSS method does. One thing it does is that we can actually get the current CSS value for a property if we want to. So that's kind of the first usage where you can see that we call the CSS method and we just give the property name, and it will return the current value of that CSS property for the selected element, or that matches what you're searching for. That's potentially very useful, of course, if you want to check, I don't know, what color something is or how wide it is, for example, or what transform it has, etc., etc. A really nice extra thing about that as well is that it gets you the computed style property, so it's like the actual final thing that is actually styling the element on the page. So if there's multiple different conflicting CSS statements, like the style file sets something to its color to red, but then a style tag at the top of the index.html sets it to blue, and then the style attribute sets it to green, then this will return the idea that it's green, because that's the fundamental CSS property that it has, because the style attribute overrides the other 2. So we can get the CSS. I'm not going to really look at that right now. Or we can set the CSS, which is great. And as you see here, it says it sets one or more, so we'll look at that, CSS properties for every matched element. And that's this second set of usages here. So I'm going to skip over the stuff around accessing properties. Although, you can see that there's a lot of serious discussion of how this works. jQuery is very preoccupied with its cross-browser stuff and all of the real specifics of how these things work. So you can learn a lot about web programming just by reading this documentation. There's also information about previous versions of jQuery and how they worked for compatibility issues that can come up. And then importantly, they often will provide you with an example, right? So that you can actually look at it happening. This is an example where you can click on different elements and you can get their background color property being spit out by the CSS, which you can see is being done here, right? So it's saying .css, and it's only providing it with one argument, which is give me the background color property, and then it's obviously it's displaying it on the page with some other instructions, but that's one usage of .css. Just give it the property name and it will return the current value of that property. However, let's continue. And there's more. There's more. There's always more. The jQuery API examples are often pretty well worked out, and they're relatively sophisticated. So it's nice to have access to that. Then we get to the second set, which is setting the CSS. And you can see that there's 3 different ways of doing that. The first way is the way that we've been doing, which is that we say CSS, we give the property name, which we can see here is a string, and we give it the value to set it to, which is either a string, or if it's the kind of property that can just be a number, we can provide a number. It's probably always safer to set it to a string, I think. And so that's what we've been doing, right? That's what we have when we say CSS color, which is the name of the property in a string, and then the color that I want to set it to in a string, which is yellow in this case, which was a horrible choice. There's also the ability to do the same thing, except you can give it a property name and a function that will actually calculate the name. This is pretty sophisticated. I would probably skip over this unless you really, really want to do something kind of sophisticated. But it's sort of semi-interesting to know that this is available, but it's probably more complicated than we want to care about right now. The other version that I do want to look at is this one, CSS, and then just one argument, which is the properties as an object. So this is useful because it allows us to set multiple CSS properties at the same time. And that's the one I want to care about. Finding an example of this in amongst the thorny discussion of the niceties of what jQuery is doing is I think it's one of the flaws of the jQuery documentation, is that I think they're a little overexcited about getting really specific about what's going on. And that's because jQuery is used for really business critical things where you have to really care about specifics. If you're wanting to play with jQuery, I think it's a little unfortunate that there's not a simplified documentation that they could provide. However, if we scroll down a little bit, we will be able to find an example of this. So here's the standard usage that we've been using, right? We say .css color and then red. So that's what we've been doing. And if we scroll a little further, we see kind of a cool thing here, which is that you can do this weird notation to add a number to a property. That's kind of interesting. You could like store that away for later on if you want to use it at some point. It's allowing that to make this thing grow, which is pretty weird and interesting potentially. And then if we continue on, I'm still looking for an example of the kind that we want to look at. Here it is here. Okay, perfect. So here we can see an example, and you can see that I'm kind of having to pick my way through these examples, which I think is not ideal. But this is something we sometimes have to do when we're reading documentation. Here's a usage of the CSS method with this kind of object version that I was talking about just here. And you can see that we say CSS, and then inside the parentheses of CSS, we have an object. So it's inside curly brackets, and in there we have just property name and value to set it to. Property name and value to set it to. So setting the background color to yellow and the font weight to bolder. The point being here that we can indeed use the CSS method to set multiple properties at the same time. So for example, if I create an object inside here, I could set the color property to, I'm not going to set it to yellow, I'll set it to blue, and we'll just see what that looks like. But I could also set the background color to, goodness me, black. I'm making some bad choices here. And I could set the font size to 10 EM. I'm making some REM. These are some bad choices. Forgive me. So this will, again, select the header class. So we know that there are 3 things on the web page that will match this. And for each one, we're going to set it CSS with the CSS method. And we're providing an object that contains all of the different properties that we want to change. And this is another beautiful convenience, right? So set the color to blue, the background color to black, black and blue, and the font size to 10 REM. And if we go over and look, our page looks really, kind of edgy, actually. Maybe this is contemporary web design. I'm just on the leading edge here. It worked, right? I mean, it changed all three of those CSS properties for all three of those things that matched the header class. So jQuery is hugely a library of convenience. This is really, really nice. Here I'm using the property names in quote marks so that I can use the proper CSS property names. It is the case that you can also, without doing that, just write background color in the camel case version, just as you can with the DOM. You can do that if you want to. I personally recommend, I think, using the actual standard CSS property names. I just think that that's smart. And then, again, the question of, well, what can I set here for the CSS? That is a question to ask the CSS documentation and all of the possible properties that you can set for an element on a web page. So let's carry on. Maybe a little more rapidly. I feel like I'm taking a bit of time here. What else can we do with jQuery? I just want to look at the classics, right? So what if I want to change the textual content of an element? So what if, for example, I've got this span here, which has the ID of example span, and it says, and here is, and then inside that it says some text in a span. If I want to change this text inside the span, how do I do that? Well, thinking in terms of jQuery, as always, I need to select the span because that contains the text. So I'm going to use the example span ID to do that bit. So I'm going to say select the thing with the ID of example span. And then what do I want to do? I want to change the text. How would I do that? In the DOM, I would use the .innerText property. In jQuery, there is the text method that I can use. And what do I provide to the text method? I provide it with what I want to change it to. So I'm going to change it to a spaniel. So target the example span and set its text to this string, which says a spaniel. If we go and look at the page, now it says, and here is a spaniel. So a nice, easy way to change some text. Just as with the innerText property, we can also use text without anything in it to get the current text. So we could, for example, put this into a variable. So if I use text with no arguments, it's going to return the text that's inside example span. So that's going to return some text in a span, the string. And then what I could do something with that, right? I could reverse it. Reversed span text is going to be the span text. This is like a little formula, right? I'm going to split it on an empty character so that it splits it into letters. Then I'm going to reverse that, because it's an array, so I'm going to reverse the order of the array, and then I'm going to rejoin it together again with an empty character. So that's going to reverse the text that we just got from the span, and then I could set that back into the span. I could select the example span again and set its text to the reversed span text. So what does that do? It's going to go find out what was in the span, reverse it, and set it back to that so that we get, and here is napsani tsek imos, which is some text in a span backwards, right? So just to say, we can use text to check what's inside of an element textually, as well as to set it. We can do, as you might imagine, the same thing with the HTML content. So we can, for example, get the HTML content in that span by using, well, again, select the span, so example span, and we can use, as you could probably have guessed, the HTML method. So the HTML method with no arguments returns the current HTML content of the span, which is just going to be the actual string inside the span because there isn't any HTML specific content there. And then I could set the HTML by, again, and maybe I should be using a variable here, but I'm not. Select that example span again, set its HTML to what? I'm going to set it to a string that has a strong tag, because I can do this because it's HTML, around the original span HTML content, which is inside that variable span HTML, and then I'll close the strong tag. Important to note, right, that this $ here is not using jQuery. This is the template literal ability to insert variables into a string by saying $ curly brackets, and then inside you put a variable name, for example. So what we're saying here is change the HTML of example span to have a strong tag, then what it used to say, which we obtained here, and then close the strong tag. So we get some text in a span, but now it's inside of a strong tag, so it's bold. So that's another way that we can manipulate what's going on a web page. Okay. How do we set attributes? We know that attributes are things like ID and class, and if we had an image, we could change the src, the source of the image. A tags have got an href attribute that we could use to change what a link points to. So we've got lots of possibilities there. One thing that I want to do is I'm just going to add quite a cool attribute to something, and I'm going to do it with the main heading. So I'm going to target the main heading. I'm going to select it with jQuery. And then how do I set an attribute? I use the Attr method that comes with jQuery. So Attr, and we use it, in much the same way that we use the CSS idea, which is that we give the name of the attribute. And the name of the attribute I'm going to set on the main heading is called content editable, which is an attribute that you can set on things that actually makes basically any textual element on a page editable by the person reading the web page, which is pretty interesting. And what do I want to set it to? I want to set it to true, because that way it will be content editable. So this is saying select the main heading, which is the h1 tag on the page, and set its attribute of content editable to true. What happens? Nothing. But if I click on the main heading, I don't know what to write. It's a wonderful life. We can edit it. That's kind of amazing. Like, content editable is a really cool attribute. So we've got this sort of editable part of our web page. That's purely because we set that attribute. So that's pretty neat. I think that's quite nice. We can use Attr just like CSS. If we give it no arguments, it's empty, we can use that to check the contents of a specific attribute on an element. So for example, we could say if I select the thick link, so for example, we know that the link has got this href. So let's select it. It's thick link is its ID. So we'll select it by ID. Let me put it like this. So we'll call it link. Goodness gracious, let link is assigned select the thick link. Then we can say if this link's attribute called href, so I'm going to get the href attribute, which is going to give me the URL that the link currently points to. If that equals https thick, which it does, then let's do something, right? So this allows us to check the attributes of a specific element on the page. So let's say that if that's true, then we could do anything that we want, right? Let's change the text of the link. So let's say if it's that, then link.text is, so this would change the link name on the page basically to what? Thick. I'm losing track of what I'm doing here. But set the text of the link to thick. So this is a thick. Well, I mean, that kind of makes some amount of sense. So it went away, it checked the attribute, the href attribute, found that it was linking to the thick website, and therefore changed the text of the link. Obviously, that's a pretty contrived example, but you know, it shows us that we can read attributes in this way. Oh my god, my phone is ringing. That's terribly embarrassing. You probably didn't hear it, and I just embarrassed myself further by even talking about it. Okay, final thing that I want us to look at quickly, which is another fundamental task that we need to understand in jQuery, is like, how do we create new elements and add them onto the page? And jQuery makes this pretty easy as well. So if we want to create an element, there's no special method. We actually use the Jquery function itself again. So if, for example, I want to create a, let's say we're going to create a paragraph. The way that I can create a paragraph, and I'm creating a variable first, right, because I want to assign this new element somewhere so that I can do something with it. What I actually can do is I can just write a tag inside here, inside the Jquery function. So this is the same Jquery function. Normally, because we provide it with CSS selectors, it selects elements on the page. But if we provide it with an HTML tag, like a p tag, open and close, it will create that element for us. And in this case, store it in this variable called $p. And then I can do stuff with that. So I could, for example, then set the text of this p tag and say fresh paragraph or something like that, so that I then have a paragraph element with the text that says fresh paragraph. We should have an exclamation mark. So that's how we create elements. We literally just use the jQuery function with the tag inside of it in a string. And then if I want to add this to the page, how do I do that? Well, I need to know where I want to add it. So let's say that I want to add my new paragraph after this paragraph here inside this section. So I'm going to target this second section. I'm going to select it, and that's the thing that I'm going to add the paragraph to. So I need to select the second section. So I do that by saying jQuery function, second section by ID, second odd. Maybe you can tell that my O key is a little ill today. Second section, select it, and then jQuery provides a method called append, like this. Very similar to the DOM standard append child. And we just give it the element that I want to append. So I've created a new element here, a P element. I set its textual content to fresh paragraph, and then I've selected the element I want to add it into hierarchically, and I'm appending it with the append method, which will add it to the end of the place I selected. So if we go and look, we get fresh paragraph here at the bottom because we appended it to this section here. There are other ways of adding these sorts of elements. There's also prepend. What do you imagine that prepend would do? It adds it to the start of the second section. In that case, we actually get fresh paragraph before the subheading, right? Because the subheading is inside the section. So when I'm adding the paragraph, when I'm prepending it to the section, it ends up before the heading. And then we can also, I believe, do things like after, in which case we could, for instance, target that that second heading here, could we? Well, no, so let's do one last thing, which is let's select every single H2, no, it's not a class, every single H2 tag, which is this one and this one, and I'm going to add this new paragraph after each one of these. So that would be to say that I want it to go in here and here, right? Which is a convenient thing that you might well want to be able to do. So I say select all of the H2s on the page and then insert my new paragraph after that element. So that's not inside it, that's just after it, like it's linearly afterwards. So what does that do? That adds fresh paragraph here and here, which is nice. So it's after the heading in both cases. And again, it magically added in multiple places because the selection selected multiple places in which to add it. So that's pretty neat. There's also before, as you might imagine, where you can add things before something else. So you can really get things in the right position quite easily in a way that is a little bit more fiddly with standard DOM programming. Final thing I want to take a quick look at, how do you remove something from your web page? You may remember in the DOM you have to get hold of its parent in order to remove it. jQuery, much easier. You simply select the thing you want to remove. Let's say we want to remove the main heading, and you use the remove method. No arguments necessary. So main heading, removes the main heading. It's gone, right? It's not there anymore. Maybe you don't remember it. I remember it well. It's my good friend. If I comment this out, there it is there. It says main heading. And if I just say select the main heading and remove, it's gone. We could do the same thing. We could remove every heading on the page if we wanted to by selecting the header class, which we know is attached to every single heading, and then all of the headings are gone. So again, jQuery is providing the super fast way to accomplish reasonably cool tasks on your web page. So it's a very helpful library. It has a very large API that provides a lot more than we've been able to look at in this video. We've seen, though, that we can change CSS, we can set attributes, we can change the textual or HTML content of elements, create and add elements, remove elements. There's a lot that we can already do. Like, we can really manipulate a web page with quite a huge amount of power. And the next thing, obviously, is we need to make sure we spend time with the documentation to understand the larger possibilities. So for now, I'm going to leave it at that. You now have the basic philosophy of how jQuery works, as well as some of the fundamental methods that we use to manipulate a web page. In the ensuing videos, we'll look at some specific other aspects of using jQuery, and that will be fun too. So see you in the next video. Bye for now.